the better part of the first 5 books of the Bible, the Israelite people were nomads. While they were wandering in the desert wilds of the Middle East, the Jewish people chased God, who appeared to them in bizarre forms. During the day, God appeared as a cloud. In the night, a giant pillar of fire. And wherever the God cloud or God fire went, that's where the people followed. And whenever God stopped, well, they popped their tents and they settled in for a while. Those resting points, they serve as key episodes in the Jewish history, even if they are a little boring by today's standards. It was in these downtimes, though, when things just weren't really happening, when they weren't traveling, when they weren't taking the promised land. It was in those downtimes that their community, their identity as a nation, and even their beliefs were strengthened, sealed, and cemented. And yet, if you stop and think about it, you almost wonder what those times were like. Maybe you can imagine their lifestyles in the desert. Israelite families sitting outside their tents late at night, maybe around a campfire while they watched the big pillar of fire on the outskirts of camp. Sadly, the Bible doesn't tell us a lot of details on the day-to-day happenings in the desert. But I can't help but wonder. Yeah, we get some stories of when the Israelites got it wrong, like when they made the golden calf and when they decided to turn and follow other gods, which was all the time. Those are big episodes, and Moses had more than his work cut out for him. But I just wonder, there had to be more than that, right? Sometimes I wonder what they talked about. Did they talk about their days? What were their days even like? What did they do when they weren't traveling from place to place? And did they ever get bored? Not that that would make for great reading, but scholars say that during a lot of those times, the stories of God were passed on orally. That is, it's likely that they would tell the stories that we find in the earliest parts of the Bible. Maybe a kid would ask their parents, "Mom, Dad, would you tell us the story about how God made the world again?" And then parents would tell their kids the story. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and then Mom and Dad would share the 7-part saga of how God brought order to chaos, how God formed the whole world, carving out valleys and scooping out places where the sea would be, and creating mountains and filling all of this with plants and animals and finally people. I think they'd probably talk about all the stories that they knew: the Garden of Eden, the Tower of Babel, the flood, maybe even the story of Job. And I bet they'd also talk about all the laws and things that Moses brought down from the mountain when he was in his most deep of prayer times. As they're all gathered around the fire, I imagine their parents would be sure to remind them of how much God loved them, and how these stories would define who they would be all their lives. And more than that, it would define who their entire nation would one day be. That's how God's people have always been formed. They didn't have anywhere to go to be formed. There wasn't a church building or a synagogue yet. They just got together with a common love of God and trust in the stories that defined them. Today, we can get so distracted by our ways of doing church. The buildings, the big stages and the flashy lights, the huge ornate stained glass windows, the pipe organs, the robed choirs, the symphony of guitars and drums, and look, those can be really helpful, and I enjoy them as much as the next guy. But that's not church. Not that. The New Testament tells us what church actually is, or at least what it was. The writer of the book of Acts, the same person that wrote the Gospel of Luke, tells us that church looked kind of like this. It was a people who devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. What's that? It's the stories about Jesus. These 11 disciples would tell about all the times that they spent with Jesus. They would sit together and they would talk about all the things, the episodes, the events they remembered, the memories of what Jesus did while he was among them. And in light of those stories, everyone, the author says, was in awe because of the many signs and the wonders performed among them. These groups, they had everything in common. They would even sell their possessions and goods, and they would distribute the proceeds of those sales to anybody that had need among them. And they spent time together, both in the temple and in their homes, eating with glad and generous hearts. Luke concludes that they praised God and they had the goodwill of all the people. And every day, God added to their number those who were being saved, which is the most amazing part to me. Just one of the wildest parts. I've been a pastor for a while. And I've never been a part of a church where people were just dying to be a part. I mean, when was the last time you heard someone say, I desperately want to be a part of your church? Or I desperately want to be a part of Wesley. How did I sign up? Usually we have to give out swag and all that kind of stuff. Well, it's probably been a while. Because most of the time, church is an event. It's a place. It's not friends around a campfire, reminding each other of how good God is and encouraging each other to hold on for another day. A couple months ago, I experienced this kind of church I'm talking about firsthand. My friends, my quarantine, and I got together on Sunday nights to hang out in backyards. It was the heat of summer, so instead of a campfire, we had a citronella candle because the bugs were bad. And we would eat, and while the kids would play in the backyard, we would laugh and talk about all of our admittedly boring weeks. We'd talk about everything from shows we were watching to foods we were trying to cook in the kitchen. And we also got to talking about how things were pretty tough. How we were nervous about the upcoming school year, and we were anxious about big decisions we had to make. We told stories of good times and God's faithfulness, of how God got us through the former times and how surely God would get us through this one too. Now, was it church? A lot of people would say, no, that's a small group, or that's just a Sunday school class. And look, I don't care what you call it. But to me, I just know I felt connected to my people and most importantly to my God. And it had been a long time since I'd felt that. Why is it that in moments like that, around a campfire or even a candle or even in a living room, talking about life and faith with people you love and trust makes you feel so connected, integrated, whole? Maybe even more so than church does. think it's because that's the way God intended it. Yeah, music is helpful, and I love it, but it's not church. Preaching is helpful, but it's not church. Buildings are a great resource, but they're not church. No, church happens when a group of nomads wandering through life pause their busyness and their chaotic lives long enough to be reminded of who God is and reminded of who they are. That's church. And that's what I hope you'll find yourself doing during these days. In the dark of night, when you're wandering in what feels like the wilderness and it just doesn't seem like there's a way out, I hope that you find that kind of church. Because that's the kind of church that's worth going to, and it's the kind of church that God intended.